particularly so that we might learn how to make an appeal, engage in an appeal, a request for someone to consider or to reflect or to perhaps ponder making a new decision based upon new information. And having finished a verse-by-verse consideration of Philemon, last week we began just to summarize and restate and recapitulate for you the principles that are related to making a biblical appeal. It was, and I'm trying to remember the name of the guy, Philip Schaff, who was a 19th century church historian. He happened to be a Lutheran by persuasion, but he was considered to be the best of the English-speaking church historians, and he described the first century as the century of the Baptists. He says if you open up the New Testament and you pay no attention to religious propaganda, now this is a Lutheran speaking now. He says if you'll just set aside all the religious propaganda, whether it be Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox or Coptic, all that kind of stuff, just set it all aside and pay no attention to it and just look at what the Bible says, and then look around at the practice of those who embrace Christianity and proclaim that they are Christians. He said, this Lutheran historian said, that the first century was the century of the Baptists, because of all of those who were practicing a form of Christianity, those who embraced doctrinal positions and those who demonstrated in their practice that which was closest to first century Christianity as it is described in the book of Acts, as it is in prospect in the Gospels, as it is explained and unfolded in the epistles. He said that would be the Baptists, okay? And there's one particular feature of the Baptist that I subscribe to very strongly. I mean, I subscribe to all that I'm aware of. That's the reason I identify as such. If I didn't, I would identify according to what the Bible actually taught. If it was different than the position that I hold, I would change positions. Why in the world would I want to be loyal to a label and not be loyal to the Bible? Amen? What's the point? So one of the things that found its full fruition in the New World, but is exhibited down through the centuries in Europe and in what is today Turkey, among those, and even in North Africa, among those groups that Baptists have historically identified as spiritual forebears, is something that is alien to most of the planet. It is alien to almost every political scheme. It is alien to just about every religious persuasion, and that is the concept of soul liberty. Soul liberty. What is soul liberty? Soul liberty is actually taught in the Bible. And soul liberty is the recognition that I and only I am responsible for I. I'm responsible for me. And because I am responsible for me to God, I am the only one who is granted by God the authority to make decisions for me. You follow what I'm saying? Now, understand that when you're knee-high to a grasshopper and growing up, you don't have the freedom to do that, okay? And so when we were kids, and those who are kids, they don't have that liberty because they've not yet reached adulthood, okay? But when it comes to dealing with and interacting with God, there is nothing wrong with me being open to being instructed by others. There is nothing wrong with me being open to the leadership of others in my life on a voluntary basis. In other words, they can't make me follow them. That's my choice. Before God, that's my choice. But that I have the absolute right and responsibility to make decisions about my soul's safety and security myself. Now, that's a very challenging position because most of the world doesn't want to grant to others the freedom to make those kinds of decisions. Okay? For example, Erdogan in Turkey. He wants to have the absolute right to make up his mind, but he doesn't want to let anybody else in his country make up their mind. Assad in Syria wants the absolute right to make up his mind, but he's not willing to grant anyone else the right to make up their mind. You think Putin believes that he has the right to make up his own mind? Of course he does, but he denies everyone else the right to make up their mind. Maybe he lets them make up their mind, but he won't let them act on it without retribution. Xi in China is the same way. He thinks he has the right to change the constitution of the People's Republic of China so that he can continue to serve as the newest and most modern of the Chinese emperors, but that nobody else in the country has the right to do that. Okay? There has been one group of people, and you look at every religious persuasion known to man, and you will not find that liberty except among the Baptists. Everybody else, it's top-down pronouncements and edicts handed down, to which you must obey or else face expulsion. Baptists, on the other hand, hey, this is soul liberty. It's freedom of association. They practiced it in Europe for 1800 years. Anywhere you can tell about these people, they practiced it, but it was not recognized in the political arena until in New England there came a guy by the name of Roger Smith. And Roger Smith founded the colony of Rhode Island, specifically because as a Baptist he embraced the notion of soul liberty and the freedom of a person to make their own individual decisions about things, spiritual things, religious, and things related to God. Now, see, what does that have to do with Philemon? It has to do with the fact that all through Philemon I've been pointing out to you that Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, has bent over backwards to avoid attempting to strong-arm Philemon into doing something that he thinks he ought to do. He is not relying upon his position as an apostle. He is not relying on his position as a senior member of the Christian family, I'm an elder. He's not even relying on, although he makes reference to these things in passing, he does not use them as leverage that should coerce or force a decision out of Philemon regarding what he's going to do, not even including the fact that he was the one who brought him to faith in Christ. Now, what is unwritten in Philemon, but if you sit down and think about it over a soft drink or a cup of coffee and discuss it with somebody who's knowledgeable about Scripture, in order for the Apostle Paul to be able to deal with Philemon this way, implicit in Paul's letter to Philemon is that Paul had already had this conversation with Onesimus. There is a young man who was a slave, and he escaped. Somehow and in some way, he ended up in Rome, crossed paths with the Apostle Paul. I don't know whether he was imprisoned with Paul or he came into the orbit of some of Paul's colleagues in the city. Long story short, he ended up coming to Christ. And by the time the Apostle Paul writes his letter to Philemon, Onesimus has already committed to returning to his slave owner. Wow. There is no possible way that the Apostle Paul would write the letter that he wrote to Philemon if he had not exercised the same approach to this young man named Onesimus. That principle of soul liberty, that principle of the liberty that you have as a believer in Jesus Christ to make your own decisions for which you will be accountable to God, you're not going to find that anywhere else. See, what do you mean? Find what anywhere else? The utter and complete absence of coercion regarding matters of doctrine and practice. You do not find it anywhere else. You do not find it anywhere else. So, let me review what we've looked at last week. In order to make an appeal to someone who is your peer, someone who is your social, spiritual, economic, cultural equal, okay, you want to ask him to consider a decision, not change his mind. Maybe to make a decision for the first time, or maybe to consider a new decision based upon new information not previously considered. There are certain things that have to be in place in order for a biblical appeal to be effective. We saw that first you must have, with that individual you are making an appeal to, you must have a right standing. That person can't have an issue against you. That person can't think that you're deceitful, can't think that you're dishonest, can't think that you're a slackard at work, can't think that you are ambitious at his expense, those kinds of things. No, you have to have a right standing. Secondly, there has to be the right basis for the appeal. If you're going to appeal to someone to make a new decision or to make a decision for the first time, you cannot request that a person consider making a decision that he views as harmful to him or his cause. So if you're going to make an appeal to someone, there's nothing wrong with making the appeal if it will benefit you. I mean, if it's not going to benefit you, why make the appeal, right? But the appeal, if it has the right basis, it will be an appeal based upon what is not only good for you, but is also good for the person you're making the appeal to. Now, if you've ever, down through the years, spent $300, $399 to get the kit for how to become a great real estate flipper, or $299 to learn how to be great on the stock market, or to do this and that, every single one of these guys for about the last 40 years, from Zig Ziglar all the way down to the present, they always talk about the win-win. The win-win, the win-win. And that is, if you're engaged in an activity with another human being, if you want to be successful, and by the way, they're right about this. If you're going to be successful in business, if you're going to be successful in whatever venture you're involved in that includes relating to other people, it has to be win-win, okay? Tragically, there are some uncouth types that engage in practices that seem win-win, but it's the appearance of win for the person they're dealing with until they find out a day, a week, or a month later that it was a raw deal, but a win for them. So in the reality, it needs to be win and win. And that's not a new concept. That's not something that businessmen developed of late. Oh no, we find this in the first century. We find this in biblical Christianity. We find this in the biblical appeal. And the biblical appeal simply does not work. It has no ability to function properly unless you grant to the other person the absolute right to make his own decision, even if you disagree. Okay? Even if you disagree. So, there has to be right standing, there has to be right basis, and third, we looked at last week, there has to be right timing. Okay? When is not the right timing for me? For example, if somebody wants to make a biblical appeal to me, it is not good to make an appeal to me Sunday morning at 10:30. Why? Why? Well, because in just a few minutes I'm kind of busy and my mind is on that. Okay? It's not good to walk up to me Wednesday night at 10 minutes until 7 and say, Pastor, I have an important question for you. Bad timing. Bad timing. Kid walks up to his dad. Dad comes home from a pressure-packed day at work, and he walks in the house, and before he got out of the car, excuse me, he had a quick prayer to the Lord. He said, Lord, I'm wound up tighter than a cheap watch. This is the most important part of my day, is when I get home and walk through the door and I'm with my family. Lord, give me grace. Give me grace. I want to be a good husband. I want to be a good dad. But, oh, Lord, I've got to unwind. Okay. So you walk in the house, you kiss your wife, you hug your kids, you kick the dog, you go over and you... Was that wrong? Was that wrong? Oh, I should say kick the cat. Okay. Okay. Cats like to be kicked. And you sit down... And it used to be, when I would tell this story, is you open up the paper. Well, nobody reads papers anymore but Eisenberger. He's the only one that reads the paper anymore. Okay. Maybe someone will sit down and turn on the television, and it'll come up to mainstream media, and he'll go, no, click Fox. Or some YouTube channel, or CRTV, or something like that. And he wants to just kind of unwind, maybe watch the Dodgers blow a game, watch the Japanese Babe Ruth down at Angel Stadium, you know, the pitcher that hits home runs, maybe do that kind of thing. But all he wants to do is just decompress just a little bit, okay? Now, you can't really teach 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds this, but there comes an age when mom needs to start training the kids. Don't run up to your dad and start asking him for things right now. Let's just wait until after supper, okay? Wait till after supper. Why? Because timing is crucial, okay? Timing is crucial. And it's good to start children when they're young, okay? Because they're going to have to come to appreciate the importance of timing in school, in Sunday school, when they're playing a sport and the coach is talking. You know, some kids never talk. I was one that was always talking, just always talking, and I had to learn how to just calm down, and I was always, you know, like this and talking, and you know, how can we do it that way, Coach? It seems like a dumb way to do it to me. I just think that there's another way to do it, and I had to learn. I had to learn. So. Right timing is important. So this evening we'll take up and continue through, hopefully finishing our recapitulation of these 7 things. Fourth, to make a godly appeal, you must convey right information. This is one of the most difficult things for anybody to do, because what they like to do is they slant the news, right? Remembering that appealing to someone is not supposed to be manipulation, be very careful to give correct and full information to the person that you want to make that new decision. After all, if you do not convey accurate information, what are you doing? If you're not conveying accurate information, what are you doing? You're lying. Yeah, you're deceiving. If that person finds out later that you withheld vital information from him, wow, is it going to be hard for you to ever gain that person's trust again, if ever. He may remember for the rest of it, yeah, that was the kid that lied to me that time. That was the kid that gave me only half the story that time, and boy, was that embarrassing. A legitimate appeal, then, should include information about both the negatives and the positives that need to be considered. Let's say that you are. Remember back in my days in engineering school, Oregon State wanted a wave tank generator to generate wave action in a tank for their oceanography department. And so they turn, as they properly should, to the mechanical engineering students to develop a huge tank and cranes that could hoist and drop things into positions and a wave generator. So when you're doing that, and you've got a customer, you want to tell them the pros and the cons, because nothing is ever black and white, okay? Nothing is ever this way or that way. There's always trade-offs, okay? You can do it cheap, and it will probably look ugly. You can do it pretty, and it will probably be expensive. And those kinds of trade-offs have to be conveyed to the customer. If you don't do that, you're deceiving them. If you present only the pretty expensive one, and you don't take into consideration that your customer may want ugly and cheap, you've manipulated him, and if he finds out about it, he's never going to use you again, okay? And you've attempted to solicit from him a decision that was favorable to you, but was unfavorable to him. So this is especially important when you know that the negatives might very well cause the person in authority to make a different decision. But if the decision you want from that guy is God's decision, and you're willing to trust God to work in his thought processes to bring about the proper resolution to the problem, then you don't need to trust him. You need to trust God, that giving him the good information is the right way to go. So if your appeal comes after prayer, if your appeal comes after seeking God's will, then you can be confident that telling the truth and conveying truthful information, both pro and con, will produce results that are not so much what you want, but which are pleasing to God. And you need to be willing to accept the result, even if you don't particularly like it. So fifth, to make a godly appeal, you have to display the right attitude. That's where this comes in. You may recall that I spent considerable time expanding on this. The right attitude when making an appeal is the result of a spirit of meekness and humility, okay? And in other words, you're approaching the person who is the decision maker, and you approach that person who has authority with humility, and you are not making demands, but you are asking for consideration, and you are requesting deliberation concerning something that is important to you and that you believe is important to him or important to her. Otherwise, you wouldn't be dealing. If it's not important, you just let it go, okay? But you're talking to this person because it is important. And of course, some people have problems in this area. Some are so proud in their spirit that their countenance and their body language and their tone of voice screams, not the words, but the net effect of what they communicate is something along the line of, I'm asking you to do this. However, if you do not grant my request, I'll still do what I want to do. I'm asking you, but I better get what I want. That's not the proper attitude to display when you're making an appeal. There are also those who convey the idea, now I'm asking you to do this, but boy, I tell you what, there are going to be consequences if I don't get my way. I remember at my first pastorate, we had a woman who was hell on wheels. She was nasty and a half. She was married and had a husband, and of course, if you're married, you do have a husband, and 2 sons. But she bragged frequently in my hearing, if anybody doesn't give me what I want, if anybody doesn't do what I say, they will regret it for the rest of their life, because I never forget and I never forgive. Whew. Wow. She made sure that her husband and her sons understood that when she was asking, she wasn't asking. When she was asking, she was not asking. She was demanding. And she would do things in a social situation where You could tell by her body language off at a distance, oh, she's hammering him right now. And her husband, name was Joe. Her oldest son was named Joe, and her youngest son, Jimmy. They literally quivered. And her husband is my size, and her son is bigger than me. And where's Tony? Is Tony in here? Yeah, you remember Kettner? Yeah. But they literally would. And it's not because of anything she could do to them physically. It's because she was a tormentor, and she would make life so bad for them that they just couldn't deal with it, and she cowered them. And I was looking. Oh, is there a place in the Bible where you can smack your wife one time? And no, there isn't. There isn't. A guy should never lay his hands on his wife, ever. It's not sanctioned by God at all. But I did look because she was just nasty. That's before I realized. You know what Joe should have done? He should have done what he should have done. She said, well, what does that mean? Just look at her and smile and do right. And then she starts shrieking at him and fussing with him and burning his food and all that. He just gets the keys, gets in the car, and goes out to a nice place and grabs himself a nice meal. He comes back home and she's still. Then he turns around, goes back, gets in the car, and drives away. He doesn't ever have to argue with her. He doesn't ever have to fuss with her. He doesn't have to do anything. All he has to do is show her that don't work with me. And eventually she'd just get tired of it. I remember a guy that came to me one time and he said, Pastor, I just want you to know that my wife threatened me that if I ever sought your counseling again, she'd leave me. And I looked at him and I said, where would she go? He said, what do you mean? I said, think about it. Where would she go? Who would have her? He said, no one. I said, yeah, you're right. It's an empty threat. It's an idle threat. There's no place for her to go. But she has you so hornswoggled. She has you so convinced that you literally quake in your shoes when she raises her voice. I said, I'm not suggesting that you should ever fuss with her. I said, you just get the keys, go to the car, and drive away. And come back a few hours later, walk in the house, and she starts in again. You okay, hon? Turn around, close the door. Where are you going? Where I choose to go. Bye. And drive away. And if she knows, once she's convinced that that will be your reaction, every single time she pulls that kind of manipulative, shrieking nonsense, in a few years she'll stop. See, a few years? Yeah, you should have had that one figured out before you married her. There's no shortcut to these solutions, okay? My point is, what must run through the mind of somebody who acts like this? Can think about a boy. Can a boy have any expectation of honorable and respectful treatment by his children when he becomes a father if he treats his mother and father that way? No. Will the man married to such a woman as this, will he be kind and considerate, or will he, unless he's a terribly weak man, will he be domineering and defensive in the face of his wife's aggressive behavior? I don't think a guy should be domineering and defensive in the face of his wife's aggressive behavior. Just, Just make sure you get the mail before she sees it so that she won't know you've got those brand new motorcycle earplugs that protect your hearing from large and shrieking volume of noise. I just got a pair. Man, they're great. So that whenever my wife screams at me, and my wife doesn't scream at me. I'm teasing. But wow, I have a whole new counseling technique. If a guy ever comes to me and says my wife shrieks at me all the time, I'll say these are wonderful, wonderful hearing protection. They're specially made for guys with motorcycles to protect their ears from the loud noise, like your Harley Davidson or your wife. Now think about it. What kind of boss needs such an employee that issues veiled threats? You know, if you don't do this, I'm going to quit. If you don't do this, I'm going to file a grievance. If you don't do this, let me tell you something about supervision. If any employee comes in with an attitude and says, if you don't give me a raise, I'm going to quit. Do you know what a smart supervisor will do? He'll get up from behind his desk and he will walk over and he'll take his hand and say, boy, I'm really sorry to see you go, but I really hope you do well. Security will be right here to help you to the exit. You say, well, what happens if you've got a kid that does that? Oh my goodness. As soon as you get a teenage boy or a teenage girl, I don't have to do what you want. I don't have to do what you say. And you don't have to get mad. You just get up and say, son, congratulations, you just made a man. And because you don't need to do what your mother or your father tell you, that means you're an adult. You could use one of our suitcases when you move out, because you're moving out. Only children live in this house, not adults. And you're gone. Congratulations, boy, I'm proud of you. I hope you do well. And he's going out the door. What happened? Your bluff just got called. Your bluff just got called. So, you know. So, you say, well, what would be a better way to do it? Well, here's a better way for an employee to do it with his boss. You say, I just don't think I'm getting enough money. I just don't think I'm getting what the market will bear. You walk into your boss and you say, I got a problem. And what is it? You know, I like working here and I want to continue working here, but I'm wondering if it's financially best for me to work here at my current pay rate, because I've gotten some indications that I possibly could get more elsewhere. So I would like to ask you, is there something that I am doing that I shouldn't do or not doing that I should do that makes me seem like I'm not worth top dollar to you? Because if there's a way that I can improve, because I like working here and I want to continue, but I need to do what's best for my family, is there something that you would recommend? And the boss will either say yes or no. But even if he says no, he's not going to be mad, because you've approached him with deference, you've approached him with humility, you've treated him in a respectful manner. And if he wants to keep you, he'll try to figure out a way. And if he doesn't try to figure out a way, it's because he doesn't want to, or maybe the reality is he just can't. Attitude is so important. Why? Because God resists the proud and God gives grace to the humble. James 4:6, 1 Peter 5:5. It's clear from the way these two verses, 1 Peter 5:5 and James 4:6, it's clear from the way these verses are worded that God's resistance of the proud and his gift of grace to the humble is a pattern of God's dealings with his people. So be humble in your appeal and resist the temptation to imitate the wicked arrogance of the world. We don't want to be like them. Number 6, to make a godly appeal, you have to use the right words. Most people don't pay as much attention as they should to what words are. Okay, words are symbols. So I have something in my mind that I want to convey to another person. my brain translates that into a symbol called a word, strings a few of them together called a sentence, and blurts it out. Error can be introduced at that point. On the receiving end, the person hears those sounds, and their brain interprets those sounds into words and seeks to understand meaning that has been conveyed. So you see, there's a possibility of error at both ends. That's the reason why when you communicate with somebody, you need to be humble. You need to be understanding. This is a process that's fraught with difficulties. Okay? And so when you're communicating with people, wow, is there a possibility? Have you ever been in a conversation with someone and back and forth, and then you realize, oh, I thought you meant... I have. I've had people say that to me, and I have said that to people. Oh, I thought you meant. See? Right words and right attitudes are so closely linked together, but it's important to realize that attitudes and words are not exactly the same. It's possible to have the right attitude, is it not, and be foolish in your choice of words. Just as it's possible to have a bad attitude, but at the same time be clever enough to cleverly select the correct words. Some people that you know use words well, but they have a bad attitude. And some people have a good attitude, but they don't use words well. And so we need to work on both our attitudes as well as our words. Every human being has some kind of preconceived notions. They have all kinds of prejudices. They have all kinds of personal preferences. And we may not even know what they are. We may not recognize our own prejudices. Bosses, parents, spouses, spiritual leaders, no different in this respect from anybody else. So for that reason, the careful selection of your words when making an appeal can effectively move through and around emotional and mental obstacles that people have in their minds. Every one of us have erected certain obstacles to communication in our minds. Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 and 4. And he talked about his evangelism had to basically bring down these obstacles so that he could communicate the gospel to people. But they exist for a variety of reasons. And properly chosen words can either pull them down or negotiate around them. And so you need to learn how to do that. An example of the wrong way to make a right appeal and a right way to the right way to make an appeal. Let's say a foolish young man. Well, let's not call him foolish. Let's just say he's just a young man. Okay, a young man finds the activities of his church group that he's a part of, shall we say, less than stimulating. Okay. The truly selfish and carnal person will say loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is boring. I'm not going to come to any activity like this anymore because this is boring and I hate being bored." And he feels like everyone on the block needs to hear him say that. Of course, God's not pleased for unsaved visitors to hear that ill-timed remark. The young man may justify his comment and say, "Well, why'd you say that word?" "Well, that's just how I feel. That's just how I feel." Okay. And it's important that everyone know how you feel. So let's move one step in the right direction. We're still short of the mark, but we're making a bit of improvement, and that would be for the young man to privately say to the person in charge, "You know, Mr. Jones, this activity is not interesting. Can we do something more interesting next time? Can we do something more interesting next time?" Now, how helpful is that remark? It's somewhat better than voicing your displeasure in front of everyone, okay? However, the spiritual young man who knows how to make an appeal and gives some thought to the careful selection of words, and who may be just as bored as the others, he will likely approach the matter in a very different way. Not willing to speak in front of others and harm people, and concerned about the success of the leader. He doesn't want to harm this man who's going out of his way and taking time and engaging in ministry when he could be doing other things. He doesn't want to discourage him, but he might approach the matter completely differently by saying something along the line of, Mr. Jones, I really appreciate your efforts to minister to us because I know you could be doing a lot of other things with your time. I'm wondering if I could join in by helping you in your ministry. Can I help you? Well, guess what? If that lad uses a little finesse and just a little bit of wisdom, that young man gets to have exactly the kind of activities he wants to have because he's working with the guy running the program and he gets to make recommendations. Hey, Mr. Jones, you think maybe we could do this? You know, that might be a good idea. And maybe we could do that. Hey, that's a good idea. And how about in 2 weeks we could do the other thing? And Mr. Jones, because he knows that none of his ideas are working really well because the kids are always going, is probably open to recommendations and suggestions. So we see how important words are when they're used in the right way with the right attitude. So that's number 6. Finally, to make a godly appeal, you have to display the right response. We examined a number of passages over this last year which clearly reveal the will of God with respect to government and work and home and church. And we see that God's will for us is submission. With that in mind, what do you imagine God's will to be should the person in authority, or in the case of Philemon, where Paul is not in authority and neither is Philemon, but the person reject the appeal or even deny you the opportunity to make an appeal? What if you walk up to your boss and say, Mr. Jones, can I ask you a question? And he says, oh, no, this is not a good time. What do? Huh? I remember one time when I was a brand new Christian, I was out doing some personal evangelism door to door, and I walked to this guy's house. I was young and zealous. What did I know? I didn't know anything. But I knock on the door, and I said, sir, may I talk to you for just a moment? Now, when I ask him a question, that's an appeal, isn't it? I'm making an appeal to a guy to make a decision, but I have no standing with him. I didn't know the guy, okay? He said, no, it's not a good time. I then display my attitude, very spiritual. Well, you'll wish you'd had time when you're burning in hell. Say, Pastor, you actually said that? Yeah. I've made every mistake 10 times at least. And then the guy said, hey, buddy, can a guy sit down and eat supper? Bad timing. So everything about my appeal was wrong. I had absolutely no business asking this guy a question. Okay? Knock on the door. So I'm here to talk to you. Just wondered if you have a moment. No, I've just sat down for supper. Sorry to bother you. Talk to you another time. Just get out of there. Get out of there. But I know guys who think that they successfully evangelized a guy who had just stepped out of the shower and was wrapped in a towel and was dripping wet. And yet they kept him at the front door for 15 minutes. Oh, that reminds me of Tony's very first time with Melanie. Remember? The very first time. Yeah, it was you. It was you. No, I'm sorry. It wasn't you. It was Bernie and it was Judy Noriega. Tony is the third most modest woman I've ever met. These were the first two. And they went out on a Saturday morning and they knocked on a door. And the guy opened the door. Yes, may I help you? And they identified themselves. We're from the church. We'd like to talk to you about the Lord. And he opens up the door. naked as a jaybird. And that was the very first time either of those two young ladies had ever gone out to talk to a stranger about the Lord. Wow. Wow. You see, what does that have to do with an appeal? Not much. But it's a good story, and it happened to be true. So, you have to ask yourself if you have the right attitude, is God pleased for you to show your disappointment when you try to make an appeal to your boss and he says no? Or you make your appeal and then he decides no? Or your pastor or your dad or your mom or your spouse, honey, could I talk to you about something that's really important? I don't feel like it right now, babe. That should be okay. Now, if you're a feminist, it's not okay. And if you're a feminist, there will be hell to pay for responding in that fashion. But if you recognize what you're doing as an appeal, and if you're going to have the right attitude when making an appeal, that should be okay. You follow what I'm saying? Now, a husband shouldn't respond that way every time, okay? He shouldn't even respond that way most of the time. He shouldn't even respond that way frequently. But if he does say, no, it's just not a good time. Understand, it's not an appeal if you show bad attitude, okay? If you show bad attitude. Or is God glorified and pleased when his child accepts the decision the person in authority has made with meekness and authority, meekness and humility? Remember, that decision could very well be to not even allow the appeal to be voiced. You walk up to your boss and say, boss, you got time for a question? Actually, no. Okay. Have a good afternoon. You don't know what's going on in his mind. That he just got word that his mother slipped and fell, and he's got to get his affairs wrapped up real fast so he can get home and look after taking care of whatever problems are associated with his mom. You don't know. And it is legitimately not a good time to talk. Or he may have just been found out from his boss that he is going to be relieved of his responsibilities. And so he's not in a position to grant anybody any favors or to listen to any requests. And he doesn't want the entire office to know that he's either been demoted or gotten a lateral move to another department. So we don't know. We don't know. A right response is terribly important for this reason. Sometimes we just don't know what's going on. And the boss will not say yes when yes is the only logical decision. Why? Sometimes a boss will say no when the only rational response is yes. Well, why would a guy do that? Why would a guy say no when it's in his best interest to say yes? He's testing you. He wants to find out how you react when he says no. He said, well, I shouldn't do that to a person. I agree. But do sometimes bosses do what they shouldn't do? Yeah, they do. They do. They do. So, how many times have I seen both parents with their children and husbands with their wives do the same thing? I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying a husband ought to do that. I'm not saying parents ought to do that with their kids. What an opportunity to show your faith in Christ when something like that happens. However, the opportunity is missed when you react poorly. So if you're going to make an appeal, one of the things you need to factor into your whole approach is to plan how you're going to react if it doesn't go well. Because remember, most spiritual behavior is planned. Most behavior that is not planned is not spiritual. Spiritual behavior is usually planned. So we have here 7 ingredients, 7 particulars, 7 components in a biblical appeal. We have got right standing, right basis, right timing, right information, right attitude, right words, and right response. And if those ducks are not in a row, and sometimes you can't get those ducks in a row because it's an emergency. But if those ducks are not in a row, unless it's an emergency, I recommend that you do not proceed with the appeal, because it's not going to turn out well for you. And I want your appeal to turn out well. I want God to bless you. I think it is a mechanism that God has given to us so that when we are in a position where someone has authority over us and that person's position is unassailable, we still have been given by God the means to deal with a situation that might otherwise be intolerable. Questions at this point? Next week we're going to go back and we're going to go quickly through Philemon to see how Paul makes use of each of these in his letter to Philemon. And